So I want to go ahead and get started here. But the first thing, while I share this, I want to say is, if there's one thing I wish most writers would lean harder into, it is the premise. I think it's one of the things that takes, I guess I wouldn't say it takes more work than other story elements, but I think the work shows up the most in this specific layer of storytelling. But it's also one of the ones that I think gets short-shifted the most. So that's one of the reasons that I want to go ahead and, gosh, yeah, here it is. Okay, that's one of the reasons I want to spend an entire webinar on your premise, which is different from your plot. Plot is what happens during the story. Premise is the concept of the story, the situation and the world that the characters are launched into. And it's multifaceted. It's not nearly as straightforward as your character, your theme, your plot. A premise is a number of different things. And I typically hear writers confusing premise with plot. And that's another reason that I wanted to talk about a strong story premise specifically. One of the reasons that this is important is because typically the premise is what gets marketed, not the plot. Nobody markets the twist in Gone Girl, right? That's the plot. Even the structure of the story is not what gets marketed. The premise is what gets marketed. And typically that gets off the ground in the first 20 to 30%, depending on your genre, and the style of story that it is, the structure that you're using. Typically that gets off the ground within the first 20 to 30% of the story. And therefore, that often means what's being marketed about your book is only that first 20%, that first quarter or third of the story is what gets marketed. So if all the exciting stuff and the really fascinating hooks and everything else in your story comes after that point, or is not in the premise, it's in the plot instead, you're going to be missing out on having all those amazing ingredients actually hit the fan when it comes time to get this out to readers. So that's one of the reasons that the premise works a little bit differently than the plot. The other thing, the related, I guess, other side of the coin to that is that your premise is your biggest piece of marketing. It is typically the element that's going to engender the most anticipation and appeal to your readers without anybody having to pay for fancy ads or do clever packaging or go on sale. These are the things that make readers' ears perk up, make them bond to your concept itself, and make them chase the book down. Wouldn't that be great if readers chased your book down rather than you having to chase down your readers? That'd be awesome, right? So we're going to talk about how to do that. Let me pull the chat up here. So like I said, for anybody new, go ahead and drop a question in the chat or just unmute yourself and talk over me. I don't mind that. I can only see the couple of you that are stacked up here in the video chain for now. So there are, I would say 5, 6-ish, depending on how you divvy these up, components of a strong story premise. People use different language for them. You'll notice I'm using a lot of Donald Moss's language from writing the breakout novel because I think his is the most clear-cut and common sense and doesn't get super abstract. I think it's the most concrete language, but Michael Haig and Matt Bird and a number of other really well-known writing craft books will use these same concepts, and they just call them by different things. But these are the 5 things we're going to be going over in this webinar: plausibility, inherent conflict, originality, gut emotional appeal, and immersive setting. My own personal belief here is that at least one of these should be an imaginative hook. I think that is really important. So we're going to be going through each of these piece by piece, but I do want to say that a premise doesn't need to have all of these. I would say, how much fuel do you want for your climb up this mountain? Really, when it comes to, there's no reason, I think, to underdevelop any of these. You certainly can have them all. I don't think there's any drawback to doing all of this. But you will see a lot of books that succeed, for example, without an immersive setting, or that are pretty wildly implausible. But usually, if you take a look at what else they're doing something else just at a level of execution that's almost magical. You know, something else carries that gap. I don't see any reason why you should have to have a gap. So aim for all of them. But these are the things we're going to be breaking down as we go, just so that you can see what's possible with a really strong story premise. The first thing here is, so why these? These components are what create an emotional experience for the reader. And I think this is what is so captivating about a strong story premise, is that it delivers its own experience for the reader. They are already having a story experience before having ever cracked your book. That's what's magical about this. And this is what 9 times out of 10 authors aren't doing. I have had to really dig for examples that do more than 3 of these 5 things. And we're going to be discussing some of those. But I was poring over my bookshelves being, looking for okay, who's doing 3 or more of these? And it's really rare. Partially because I think authors work on a lot of intuition. We've been educating our gut for years, right? Consuming great story. We grab an idea, we know that it's good, or we're working under deadline, or we can't pinpoint quite what's working, or not working about the premise, and we just run with it and we iron out the plot as we go. But most of our attention then comes after the fact, once the premise is already set. And then when we go back to revise, what are we working on? Character, theme, execution, scene, length, writing to, your editor's notes, revising layers, all those sorts of things. And none of that is premise. None of that is premise. And I think that is oftentimes why it's so hard to write a breakout book, is because our process of writing typically doesn't dig into a premise nearly as much as it digs into all the other layers. We're far more prone, just as a subset of humans, to grab a cool story idea that has some excellent things about it and run with it and then make it work after, rather than analyzing our ingredients ahead of time. So another thing you'll notice is that characters, theme, and execution determine the quality far more than the premise. These aren't necessarily story quality ingredients or a determiner of quality. An excellent premise, can be shot all to hell in execution. And a story can wildly succeed that has a very quiet or even limp or low concept premise as well. So this doesn't mean your book will succeed, but it definitely raises the chances of it drawing readers to it, just as a matter of its function in the world. And it will, while it won't determine the quality of the story, it will give you those foundational ingredients to get the quality of your execution noticed by a much broader audience. So I think that what I really want to highlight here is the bond that a compelling premise creates in the reader. And you cannot pay for that kind of marketing. You just can't do it. This is what generates word of mouth most often. It's the experience you're giving the reader beforehand. It's what makes them willing to put down money just after seeing your book appear on Goodreads, or hearing somebody talk about it at a book club, or makes them pick it up at a library and then go buy it for themselves or share it around. So I think just to repeat my own self, because I think it bears repeating, this layer does not get broken down often enough in storytelling. So that's what we're going to do. The other things to remember here are that I shouldn't skip ahead of my own slides. That a clean, lean, simple story is one of the most difficult things to create. If your idea is simple, that doesn't mean it's bad. And compelling premises are not always stacking twist on top of twist on top of layer on top of layer. You're looking for clean, simple, lean ideas that themselves have power. Again, that comes down to the bond that you're trying to create with the reader, just from in hearing about your book before they ever crack the cover, and in the simplicity and memorability of the story. It's a lot easier to remember and attach to something that is a simple, cohesive whole than it is a sprawling. Ask anybody what Game of Thrones about is. No one can tell you. Premise is not really where that story succeeded. Then again, case in point, it still succeeded. So don't aim for the most interesting thing that you can dream up. Don't try to, well, I won't say don't because Game of Thrones did it, but typically a successful premise is not layering massive cultural shifts and multiple families at war and magic and warfare and subterfuge and political machinations and all these, heaping it onto the plate. Stuff gets lost, and that's typically not the compelling, cohesive, lean, simple story that's going to connect with people at the idea level. So you're not always aiming for more. What you're aiming for is deeper. Same as with stakes, right? You don't always want like fate of the world. You want something that matters deeply to the main characters. Same here with your premise. Don't aim for the biggest, most interesting thing you can dream up. Aim for something that you can personally identify with. What's the most interesting thing that you can personally identify with? You're building your own emotional investment and your own emotional expertise into the story. Doesn't mean you have to write about your own backstory or your trauma, but what emotions do you personally know and care about? Build that into your premise. So with those things as kind of our guiding principles on why these things work and how to frame them, now we get to plausibility. And what, of course, is plausibility? That doesn't mean a commonplace story. That just means a story with a basis in reality. What you're looking for is a bridge from the reader's life into the story. So for example, in Stranger Than Fiction, has anyone else seen Stranger Than Fiction? It's one of my all-time favorite movies. I love it to death. If you haven't seen it, go see it. Emma Thompson, Will Ferrell, Maggie Gyllenhaal. It's beautiful. It's beautifully written. It makes me cry. I love it. So in Stranger Than Fiction, Harold Crick is an IRS auditor. It doesn't get more commonplace or more real than that, right? And he has a painfully boring life, right? He eats the same thing for breakfast. He brushes his teeth the same way every morning, counts his strokes. He ties his tie the same way. This guy's life just ticks like a clock, and it's ticking down, and he doesn't even know it. In Breaking Bad, Walter White is a high school chemistry teacher, failed genius. He's got a family, a mortgage, disappointed dreams. The guy's just a basket of sad, right? It's very, very normal, and we can imagine that. We've all had those moments. Die Hard, even. John McClane, New York City policeman. Maybe not all of us can imagine that, but we know of policemen, right? We know of estranged wives. We know of marriages on the rocks, relationships on the rocks, holiday work party. What's more relatable than that? We've all been there or have a bridge into that kind of situation. Die Hard, yeah. Die Hard is a great movie. It's very precise. If you're into tropes executed well with like genuine human emotion, it's an excellent example of precision storytelling. The Hate U Give, right? Star, high school student, out for a drive with a friend after a party. Very, very normal. So these are our bases in reality for these stories. And notice Breaking Bad, the story of terrorism and robbery on a scale most of us, never even hear about, right? But where does it start? A holiday party. We have very normal starts to these stories that end up being very larger than life. And that's why the plausibility is typically, your window into stories that are bigger than what most of us can imagine or relate to. And they're essential, actually, for grounding the reader in your story. That's why you want it. So the next element is inherent conflict. Matt Bird in The Secrets of Story also calls this situational irony or paradox. So it gets called a couple different things, but basically it comes down to a couple different, this can show up in a couple different ways. Problems in your world. Game of Thrones, lots of problems in that world, right? Many cultural shifts, many competing powers. Opposing forces, relationship conflict, generation gaps, ideological oppositions, conflicting goals, and again, these paradoxes, even things the hero doesn't want to do. The internal conflict isn't enough. You need external conflict, right? A great external conflict is something the hero does not want to do. They don't want to have to break the law to save somebody. They don't want to have to risk their own life. They don't want to have to give up on their dream, whatever it is. So examples, Stranger Than Fiction. It's only when Harold discovers his boring, pointless life might end that he starts pursuing the things he wants to live for. Or in Breaking Bad, pay for his life-saving cancer treatments. Chemistry teacher Walter has to make meth under the nose of his DEA agent brother-in-law. There's conflict built into that world. Not only is he a teacher, and not only is he very ill, but he has a brother-in-law whose very job is to stop the thing that Walter feels he has to do to save his own life and save his own pride. There's conflict built into that world. That's not even the plot of the story. You know, the plot is more about him recovering from cancer, his relationships falling into turmoil, and his quest to become this meth king, right? That's the if you've seen Breaking Bad, that's the thrust of the plot. That's not really the premise. Or Groundhog Day. There's lots of situational inherent conflict here. A man who just wants to get his least favorite day over with is doomed to repeat it endlessly. So that's that paradox or that situational irony. It's also something he doesn't want to do, you know? So a lot of the times the conflict in the world, again, not the plot, but the conflict in the situation of the world will show up in multiple different ways, as a relationship conflict, as also opposing forces, as also problems in your world and conflicting goals. So see, you'll hear me say double duty a lot in this webinar, but see if you can get your inherent conflict in the world, not the plot conflict. Maybe they're the same thing. If so, awesome. But see if you can get them to pull double duty by being multiple different types of conflict. Again, that goes towards making a lean, simple, memorable conflict that still goes very deep. No less complex for being simple. Okay. So then after plausibility and inherent conflict, we come to originality. And this is what can be really, really tough about stories, right? There's nothing new. Really, we're working with the same ingredients that we've been working with as storytellers for. However, you know, life doesn't change, but our perspective on life does change. So when you're looking to build originality into your premise, look for a fresh angle or a genuinely new perspective on something familiar. New backstories to familiar characters, new futures to old stories. For example, Hamilton. That's one of the reasons it became a breakout hit. He's disrupting the myth of the founding fathers to bring us a story of immigrants and marginalization told through rap music. There's a couple new elements of originality there just in the concept. And that's part of what drew people to it before they'd ever heard the music or knew what the story was this original premise, right? Another way you can do that is by giving us the opposite of what we expect. Heroes who win in a horror film. When does that happen? You know, a horror film with a fulfilling ending. Typically an element of horror is that you aren't fulfilled. That's the scary thing about it, right? Is that you're confronted with a horrible fear and you don't win. But Get Out did it, and it did it successfully. And everyone was like, this one's different. Or very boring IRS auditor Harold Crick discovers his life is going to end. Here's the original element. A lot of authors would have given him cancer or had him, you know, have another serious illness or discover that he's dying in some very predictable, normal way that would fit with his life. But the original element comes in here because he's going to die because his life is being narrated by an author of tragic novels who always kills her characters. What a wildly original reason for your character to die. So then that sets off his quest. Again, that's not the plot. That's just the premise, right? His life's going to end because it's being narrated by a tragedy author. And he's not a character in a fantasy world. You know, he lives in the same universe that the author lives in. And that's kind of the magic of the story. They never really explain that. It's just a fact of the world. But that launches then the premise where he has to convince this author to write a new kind of story. And of course we get twists and all sorts of things along the way, but that's not what gets marketed about the story. And that's not what's original about the story. What is original is the reason his life is going to end. You can also achieve originality by combining two discrete elements. This can be genre mixing or combining the ordinary and the extraordinary, which is exactly also what Stranger Than Fiction did there, you know, very normal with the very not normal, which is also something we discussed in the First Lines webinar, right? That juxtaposition creates originality. You can also force two totally different characters to rely on each other in a unique relationship. So 30 Rock did this too with Liz Lemon and her boss. What's his name? Jack, something like that, I think. So Parks and Rec, though, is an even, I think, more recent example here with Leslie Knope and Ron Swanson, right? He's her boss. They're totally different types of people, totally different ways of viewing the world, very different political views. They're rivals and enemies as well as friends. And while, you know, it's a loosely concepted show rather than a tightly concepted novel, the concepts for multiple premises end up being end up revolving around their relationship a lot in really fascinating ways. You know, she has to circumvent her boss as an obstacle, or he's trying to circumvent her as an obstacle. But that relationship in the office ends up being a pillar of the show, even though they're completely opposite kinds of characters. That creates a level of originality. We haven't necessarily seen liberals and libertarians being forced together to work in government positions that often. That's a pretty fresh angle. As is for Breaking Bad. We haven't really seen terminally ill chemistry teachers becoming meth kings that often. Like, I wouldn't say that is, you know, an overworn trope. Yeah, I love Leslie. She's awesome. So that's a number of different ways you can create original plots. The next element here is an immersive setting. And this doesn't have to be geography. It can be a world, a town, a specific home. The show has a lot of problems, but the Waltons, their home was a symbol for a long time for a lot of the TV watching public of American Family, because the show was set in, you know, this home that was this centerpiece for the show, and a huge set, and a lot of the conflicts happened there. Also offices, communities, job fields. Spotlight, the film Spotlight builds up a job field and an office as the world of the show in a really compelling manner. The Office builds up an office as a very compelling world for the show as well. We don't get out into the town, really, you notice. It's the workplace that gets examined, the relationships there. You have multiple locations within it, right? The meeting room, the annex, the kind of bullpen, Michael's office. They've created a surprisingly large world for that show, and a surprising number of power dynamics and conflicts and struggles within that tiny little office building. So an immersive setting doesn't have to be an imaginative place geographically. Just build up what's there. If you're writing a family drama or a romance, make that kitchen iconic. You know, make the living room and the back porch and the little room under the eaves that's full of grandma's boxes. You know, make these comforting, secretive, iconic, concept-driven places. When you walk your characters into a room, the reader should know how to feel about it. And you also want to make sure that it is a place that you know well enough that you can give insider detail. So you can do that either through a lot of research or having known it yourself, or of course a mix of the two. But you want to give readers that insider detail because they want let into a new experience, right? People come to story to experience something new. They expect a journey. They want to go somewhere. And setting often gets left by the wayside, because, which, you know, is surprising to me, because everybody knows readers want to go somewhere, right? Or they want to get trapped somewhere. You know, like maybe nobody wants to go to the world of the Hunger Games, right? There's that, what is that fantasy meme where all the fandoms are saying, you know, I want to go to Hogwarts. I want to go to, Narnia. Nobody wants to go to the world of the Hunger Games, or Game of Thrones. Well, maybe some people do, but It doesn't necessarily have to be a comforting world that you build. It doesn't necessarily have to be a place people want to go. You can make them feel trapped there too. But they're still escaping from their world. You know, they're still being taken someplace, even if it's not a comforting place. So you don't even have to think of your world building as a thing that you have to, or, you know, a world that people want to spend time in. It just has to keep them there once they're there by capturing their imagination, really, and their emotions. Readers also want surprising information. We all love being the insider. You know, we all love having the inside track. That's kind of what's appealing about, you know, conspiracy theories, those sorts of things. A lot of people, conspiracy theorists especially, you know, like I think what a lot of times what happens there is people, it's that tendency of ours on overdrive to be the ones really in the know, right? So to have discovered, you know, some plot, or to be the ones with the special information, those kinds of things. That's also kind of why we like stories about FBI agents or, you know, secret organizations, those kinds of things. So figure out what's surprising secret information in your world. And how does, not just in your plot, but like in the world, what is in those boxes in the attic? And who would be shocked to find it out? And who has been holding it back? You know, who put it there and why? Those kinds of things. Put surprises in your world, even if it's a low concept family drama. If you have read This Is Where I Leave You, well, don't read This Is Where I Leave You by Jonathan Tropper. It's great voice, but it's like the male gaze and is so strong you could choke on it. The movie's much better. But there's hidden secrets between every member of that family. It's a Jewish family who comes together after the dad's death, and these adult kids who've all gone their separate ways, and some of them not talked in years, have come together, and they're all grieving differently, and they've all got different things going on, but every one of them has a secret, and it affects everybody else in the family in different ways. And it all comes to a head in that house. And that the location not only provides a contained environment, which is awesome in settings, it works super, super well, but the setting also takes everybody back to who they were as kids. And so it forces a lot of long buried conflicts. It's easier to ignore conflicts when you're away in your own place, right? But you get forced back to who you were as a kid, or you get forced back into a previous situation, and all of a sudden that conflict is alive again. So see what you can do in your setting with that. Know your problems of place too. What are the power struggles here? Who has been, you know, who's angling for what? Who has opposing goals here? Even in Parks and Rec, right? The problems of place would be the Society for Family Stability Foundation, you know, going up against Leslie at every other turn, right? There's also Councilman Jam, you know, with his special business interests and his shoddy dentistry and his complete inexperience. There's also the other councilman, the Councilman Dexhart, who keeps having all these scandals and whatnot. And of course, Leslie's conflict with having to govern a largely uneducated public and wanting to serve people who are trying to get her out of office because they don't like her for whatever reason. So there's problems of place happening, even in relatively sprawling, loosely concepted TV shows. You still have strong settings, perhaps especially in those, because the writers know this is part of what carries those types of stories. Especially if you're writing something that doesn't have a, you know, a life and death stakes kind of story, especially dig into your immersive setting, because it is one of those things that can help carry a story. Romance and horror also benefit especially from having immersive settings. It increases tension, it increases conflict, it increases, you know, emotional appeal, reader investment, all those sorts of things. If you haven't seen Parks and Rec, well, I don't know, I'm Chris Pratt, sigh, but Parks and Rec, it's an awesome show. If you haven't watched it, it's a really fun one. Also, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, strong sense of place in that office, right? Right? Yes, I see people getting excited. Lots of problems of place happening there. Strong community identity. That's another element of setting that typically gets left by the wayside, is who are these people? I grew up in a tiny little town in rural Missouri, but second poorest county in the state, and a lot of family farms, a lot of generational poverty, a lot of drugs, those kinds of things. But there was also, you know, a lot of loyalty and a lot of buried secrets and a lot of calling somebody your neighbor even though they live 5 miles away. So there's a very strong community identity there, and that's something that is a tremendous force on stories. Think about also in Game of Thrones, right? People from the North have a very strong sense of identity. And then that conflicts, of course, because then you go beyond the wall and they think they're from the North and they call people from the North Southerners, and it makes everybody mad, right? Because this connects to your community identity. So make sure you're building that into your story. Even if what you're writing, again, is a family drama, make sure that that family has its own sense of identity. Who does this family set themselves up as? What is their family mythology? You know, the Starks view themselves as a very specific kind of family. They value certain things. They honor is huge, right? It's what gets Ned killed. And it's what causes his sons, you know, to try and then go to avenge him, which is the concept that launches, you know, the show. So, especially again, if you're writing romance, that's another awesome thing to build in to amplify stories that you may, well, lots of romance can have life and death stakes, but if you're not working with cool explosions, you know, these are some of the other things that you can lean on to help build up that concept. So again, here my example. It becomes, I think, really clear when you think about Brooklyn Nine-Nine or Parks and Rec or The Office, these places that lean heavily on immersive setting, and they're quirky small town traditions. What are your family traditions? What are the holidays like? Everybody has holiday traditions, and yet when you open a book, the Christmas traditions are almost universally the same. The Thanksgiving traditions, the Easter traditions. It's like people write in the most generic version of the family traditions. And that's like, nobody does that in real life. So that's an awesome way to complexify that setting and give it a lot of depth and conflict. Gut emotional appeal here, I think, is the next element. And I think the thing to really keep in mind here is appeal doesn't always mean positive appeal. Appeal can mean just simply that we're emotionally drawn to it. It can be for catharsis reasons. It can be to, you know, exercise, you know, really deep fears. It can be to examine something that we have, you know, lurking inside ourselves, or that has our own lives have touched on. So appeal isn't always, it doesn't necessarily mean a positive appeal here. But where this comes from in a premise is a character on a journey that resonates powerfully, right? This comes from the character journey, dealing with emotions that you personally know, but magnified on a much bigger screen. And it's magnified, right, because we're shaping it into a narrative. It has to hit breaking points. It has to hit crisis points. It has to cause change or cause failure of change. So the goal is an element that feels personal, produces a physical reaction in the reader, and makes them look at their life differently. And this here is a key part of what generates that anticipation for your story. One of the key ingredients in a premise that really launches this out to readers in a way that they'll grab and run with. It grabs your gut. And people, this is a very markety, you know, business forward way to think about it, but people buy with their gut. They just do. They remember with their gut and they buy with their gut. And I think that honestly is amazing if you're building something something whole and worthy and complex for them, which even pure entertainment is, right? You know, I don't think that there is really such a thing as junk food. You know, it's either worthy is a tough has some implications that I don't mean here, but even content that is purely entertainment and not examining, shall we say, the meaning of life, I think still examines the meaning of life in that it validates the things we want, and it validates hope, and it validates humor, and all these sorts of things that work on us in positive ways. So as long as, I don't think it's manipulative, with your readers to offer them something that grabs them by the gut because you want your book to sell well. I still think that's in service of art and in service of the reader, because you are offering them in something innately positive. Making them want it is not a gimmicky thing. So when I talk about using your story elements to market your book, I'm not of the camp of writers that thinks, marketing your book is poor art. I think it's in service of art. And two very different examples here, but two that grab you by the gut are, The Notebook by Nicholas Sparks. And that's an innately compelling emotional element here because it's a last moment of romance, in a love that lasted decades. That, that moment at the end of it that the whole story spins around, where she remembers who her husband was, will make even very, very practical, pragmatic people, feel something. And then Beloved by Toni Morrison, the story of a mother haunted by the ghost of the daughter she killed to save her. That has a ton of gut emotional appeal to readers. And it was, it won I don't know how many awards and was a bestseller for how long. As was The Notebook. Viewers and readers love these pieces because it grabs them in the gut and they remember it and carry it around with them. And nobody has to tell them, go buy The Notebook. When was the last time you saw advertising, for that book? Granted, it's older, but like oftentimes fans are what are advertising stories with premises like these. And they end up, obviously people still market them because people are going to market a successful book, but a lot of times it gets that word of mouth going, which is what everybody wants for their book, right? Everybody tells you, word of mouth, that's the thing that you have to get from readers. And honestly, like most of the time, this is how you get it. Sometimes you end up getting it simply because people read it to start with and they loved it so much that then the quality of the story, carried it, which is how I think a lot of times you get cult favorites like Arrested Development. Or how books like Gone Girl end up getting marketed. Everyone says, oh shit, that twist. And everyone's like, what twist? I must know. But those books and those stories, if they're movies, still pulled the readers in somehow initially. Nobody's going to discover your twist or your quality of your execution or, whatever else it is that would make your book a sleeper hit if the readers aren't drawn to it initially to say, oh shit, that twist, or that ending, or, whatever it is. So then here, coming back to these 5 elements, the plausibility, inherent conflict, originality, emotional appeal, and immersive setting, one of those should be an imaginative hook. And that's my own little plea for Flights of Fancy here. I think I didn't set it as a separate element because I think that you're going to be hard pressed to just tack that on to your plot pitch, right? But if you can make that emotional appeal also an imaginative hook, or the setting imaginative, or something in the conflict just really clever and interesting. Like to me, it's an imaginative hook that Walter White goes from failed, genius chemistry teacher to meth king. It's incredibly shocking to see him go through this transformation. The transformation that implies makes you wonder how in the world or what if. And that's really what that imaginative hook should do, is make the reader wonder what if, in whatever way you can make them wonder that. Typically the imaginative hook is not going to be the plausibility, because that's your element that's our bridge from the reader into the world or into the character. So if that's wildly imaginative, then you end up losing, some of your groundedness or your connection to the reader. But anything else, go for it. The world, see where you can make that wildly imaginative and fascinating. And of course, that's going to vary reader to reader. So if you have a strong sense of who your ideal reader is, that's going to shape a lot of these premise pieces, because what is plausible is not going to be plausible to every reader. What is going to be emotionally appealing is not going to appeal to every reader, and you're not trying to get every reader, right? You write something for every reader, you're writing something for no one, right? It's the principle of the everyman character. You write somebody who's supposed to be everybody, and you end up with somebody who's nobody, you know. So develop a really strong sense of who your ideal reader is for this book, and let that kind of guide some of these choices, or let these choices that you make guide who you're writing for. You know, they can kind of hold hands and push pull that way. So keep the reader in mind when you're making these choices, because it will definitely inform your choices, and what's imaginative to one reader is not going to be imaginative to another reader. So you can either broaden your audience that way by having the emotional appeal reach one subset and the imaginative hook reach another subset, while the conflict, you know, reaches somebody else, or you can have them all, you know, targeted for the exact same type of reader too. So that's something else you can do. Somebody's asking in chat here, quick question about the Breakout workbook. Should you read the novel before doing the workbook? They cover the same ground. There's a couple different versions of it. There's writing the Breakout novel, then there's the writing the Breakout novel workbook, and then there's one that's the Breakout novelist or something like that. But the workbook itself contains all of the content of writing the Breakout novel itself. So you only have to buy the workbook if you want to do those exercises. And also someone is asking, do you want the imaginative hook to work into one of those 5 elements, or is it completely separate? Is it stronger if it plays into one of the 5 things you discussed? I think a lot of it just depends on what your hook is. If your hook is maybe a career field, for example, you're writing about the incredibly fascinating world of chemistry teachers, then, and that's your hook is real science, you know, chemistry, then it's already in your concept. But if it's something like, I don't know, dragons come to town, then it may need to be its own element, right? Or though maybe dragons are your inherent conflict, and that's the problem. Game of Thrones has done that in a couple of seasons with White Walkers, right? That's the impending doom over the whole show, actually. So that's actually a great time for me to bring up what I think is one of the other guiding principles here, is making these components pull double or triple duty. And that goes back to making it a clean, lean, simple story. Not simple as in not complex. Something can be simple and very complex at the same time. But not complicated. The more you pile onto a premise, the more complicated it is. And that works against making it memorable and punch. So I would say make these things pull double and triple duty as often as you can. And Don Draper has his problems, but in Mad Men, he says, make it simple, but make it significant. And I've printed that out and hung it above my computer because it is such a strong guiding principle. Simple, significant things have a lot more power than sprawling, complicated things. They're easier to attach to. The complexity is often in the subtext and in the nuance of them. So it ends up being a very rich, powerful idea, partially because of its simplicity. So when you're looking at all these elements, don't let them sprawl you out, let them draw you deeper into a simple, significant idea. Especially, like if you'll notice a lot of these examples in Stranger Than Fiction, the conflict is also the emotional appeal, is also the originality. The fact that he has to go confront this author who's writing a tragic novel of his life that will eventually kill him. You know, that's 3 of those 5 things right there. And I think that's part of why it ends up being, even though it ends up being a very simple but significant story, is that those elements are pulling double and triple duty. And also means you can get way more conflict out because you can build inherent conflict into your plausibility, into your originality, into your emotional appeal and your setting. You can build immersive setting into, you know, all of these other things. So look for ways that you can make them serve each other. Is it too late to submit sample premises for review? No, if you want your premise broken down, the next workshop, I'm planning on taking your premise paragraph and breaking it down according to these six, if you can't imagine it, hook ingredients. So if you want yours critiqued, email me and I'll put you in the random drawing. I think so far only 4 people have volunteered. So I could probably do 6 in the session. So questions? What else do you all want to know?
Okay, so when you're talking about writing out your premise paragraph, like are you talking about just writing out, the sentence?
Yeah, your log line, or basically the conflict of your story, the concept of it. Queries typically tease, but what I'm looking for is the actual concept. Go ahead and spoil it if you want, but I'm looking for what's the situation and problem your character faces, and who are they and in what world does this happen? Essentially the back of the book, except, go ahead and spoil it if that ends up being part of the concept, because we're looking to analyze the elements of the story, whereas the back of a book is looking to tease the reader.
Okay, that makes sense.
Question about when you're doing your premise, and if you have 2 main characters who are you telling them from alternating points of view, which character do you pick to focus your premise on? Because I know you said to keep it lean.
If it's dual point of view, you could use that as well. Or you could present that in your pitch. Present 2 characters. Hopefully their stories are tightly woven, and the stakes affect them both. Hopefully they're both at conflict, in some way, and therefore they're both inherently part of the concept of the story. But yeah, also, make sure that your pitch paragraph fully represents what is the concept of this story too. You shouldn't have to leave out, if the story spine itself is lean and strong, you should be able to present it in 3 or 4 sentences. And if you can't, then that could come down to pitching skills, and where maybe you need help identifying what the spine of your story is, or it could come down to a story that is either A, just low concept, or B, not focused enough.
So how do you, okay. I was like,
does that not help?
Well, it does, but now I have so many more questions. But I see someone else has.
Let's see. Yeah, Stephanie was asking in the chat, any tips on adding or magnifying emotions that we know within a story, and how to do this without sounding forced? Okay, so in Stranger Than Fiction, one of the reasons that I really love it is because the main character has been living this, a very predictable, counting his brush strokes when he brushes his teeth in the morning kind of life. There's no real point or value to the way he is experiencing his own life. He doesn't find value in it other than in just continuing on how he's always continued on. He's not living life. So he has a very commonly seen emotional journey of learning to truly live, right? How often do we see that? That's not all that original. But it is incredibly compelling because it's put in a new situation. And that new situation magnifies what is a well-known emotion of saying, oh gosh, I have not been living my life. I need to live it fully and bravely, and I need to figure out what I'm here for, and I need to chase it because life will be over too soon. So that is an emotion that we've seen explored in a lot of different ways in a lot of different stories, but it's also one that gains new meaning every time you give it to a new person in a new situation. And she magnifies it by making him a hero in a tragic novel that this author is writing, and he's going to be killed off. So that adds this element of horror, like he's essentially going to be murdered, but the author doesn't know it, and we like the author. And this is something she's struggled with her own self. His emotional journey also becomes her emotional journey, because she's struggling with the value of life, and the author is, and has a crisis where she says, all these people that I've killed. So his emotional journey makes her start valuing life differently. And the moment at which he says, you should do it, this story's worth it, there's something worth examining here, she says, isn't that exactly the kind of life you want to save? And so their emotional points mirror each other and impact each other in ways that magnify it as well. So see how you can mirror that emotion to give us different sides of it, make it impact different people in different ways, and amplify it that way. That's one way you can magnify those emotions. Another way you can do it is by giving them higher stakes. Make it mean more. When people have more to lose, it pushes the problems deeper. So when your marriage is falling apart or your relationship is falling apart, if you're also in physical danger, it puts a tremendous pressure cooker on that relationship. And if the relationship fails, you both may die. So that magnifies the failure of this relationship. Or, for example, there is a, What Alice Forgot by Liane Moriarty is a book that made a huge impact on me, and it examines basically that. The way we change over the course of 10 years. Would we look back at who we were 10 years ago and recognize ourselves now? She magnifies it by making it a literal problem rather than an abstract one. The woman hits her head and forgets the last 10 years of her life. And last she knew, she was newly married, had just bought their first home with her husband she was crazy in love with, and they were remodeling it, and she was pregnant with their first baby they'd been hoping for a long time. 10 years in the future, her sister doesn't talk to her anymore. Her marriage is essentially over, and their house is beautiful and done, but their 10-year-old hates her. Yes, rent Stranger Than Fiction on Amazon this weekend. I love it. It's so fun. There's also, a bakery in it, which is really fun, and Maggie Gyllenhaal's hot, so, why not? But that totally distracted me. Where was I? I was talking about, What Alice Forgot. So it makes a fairly abstract problem very, very concrete and literal by having her forget the last 10 years of her life and having to figure out, who was I then and what changed? Everyone reacts to me now like I'm this bitter, jaded person who pushes people away. And last she knew, she was this warm-hearted, welcoming, compassionate person. The title of that book was What Alice Forgot. And so the collapse of her marriage becomes connected to her sense of identity. And of course it is. Every time you have a relationship failure or a relationship change or a new relationship starts, your identity shifts a little, right? But she makes this very concrete and magnifies that, and such that we can look at it, and pushes it to breaking point by attaching it to a woman who physically cannot remember who she was or who she is now and how her relationship got to this point. And I read that book twice and recommended it to my aunt, who's a behavioral therapist. And she read it and she now gives it out to her clients. And that's not to make it sound like, vegetables. It's not, I think oftentimes in the discussion of premise and theme and character and execution, it can sound like we're, like handing out vitamins to people. And that's not what books are for, right? They're supposed to be entertaining and enjoyable to read, or escapist, those sorts of things. So I'm not saying it's a therapy exercise to read this book, but it is deeply human. And it pushes very specific emotional moments to breaking points and to a level of amplification or magnification such that we get clarity on them. So, and how to do that is going to shift dramatically depending on what you're looking at. And the genre, the way horror would push a failing relationship is very different than how fantasy or comedy might push it, So take a look at your genre. This is where comp titles can come in really handy too. But take a look at your genre. Take a look at the story elements you like playing with. But basically, you want to push those emotional moments. See if you can push them to concrete plot points. Turn that relationship or that emotional experience into a plot point if you can. And that's part of how you make it simple, is that it's an event now rather than an abstract idea, rather than, oh, I haven't seen The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, but everyone's talking about it. I feel like I should see it. So not to talk about failing relationships too much, but like I think what Alice forgot is an excellent example of that, turning those abstract, emotional experiences into tangible plot points. What other questions do you all have? I figured this would be a fairly question-heavy session since premises are so vital to really compelling story execution. So if you've got them, throw them at me. Name a YA fantasy novel that does these elements well so I can fully grasp it. Let's see. The November Girl by Lydia Kang does this just really, really well. It's very original. There's tons of inherent conflict. It's very plausible. It has a ton of gut emotional appeal. Anna Dressed in Blood, that's a good recommendation. Also, Lydia Kang's new one out this year, Toxic. That's more sci-fi, but very space opera-y sci-fi, though it has this incredibly unique element of a living bioship, so it's kind of fringe science too. So there's a lot of real science in it, and there's also a contained environment, and tons of inherent conflict. The premise is this young Korean girl was created by her mother in secret and raised in tandem with the ship. That there's one of the first ships of its kind way out in deep space, and her mom is an engineer on it, and there's people have been living on the ship for most of their lives, but now the ship is dying and they don't really know why, and so the ship has been evacuated, and they're sending in a team of convicts who have basically are receiving a death payment for living on this ship until it dies, and they all are contaminated with all the radiation and everything on it to track its death and figure out why, so that they can continue, development of better ships. But this girl, because she was created in secret, was left on board this ship, and her mother would go to prison for life if they found out that she had created this young girl. And the ship is kind of her other parent. It has a color language, it has emotions, it has a sense of self, but it's still a program, so it's kind of futuristic AI meets conscious life for this ship, but it's dying, and so it's malfunctioning too, and it creates this like tremendously scary horror environment. So it's a closed environment, it's a horror environment, it's full of inherent conflict because their literal world is dying and they're in deep space. And of course, the love interest is one of this team of mercenaries who's come to die on this ship so that he can get a payment to send to his family. So and none of that is the plot, right? That's just the premise. And it has all of these elements in it, tremendously immersive, tons of gut emotional appeal. A girl created in secret who's only just discovered that her life is going to be over at 17 years old, and she's never gotten off this ship, which has been her lifelong dream, is to, be a real person, quote unquote, and get to have friends and get to fall in love and all these things. And she's got less than a week left before this ship dies, and they're, up a creek in outer space. And a lot of that is an imaginative hook, like this living bioship with a color language and a contained environment, and a team of mercenaries, come to document this death. All of that's incredibly imaginative. Yeah, if you haven't read it, go read it. Like, I won't say Lydia Kang is undiscovered, because her adult novels are, incredibly popular. Amazon's done great work marketing them too, and they're just genius. But her YAs are kind of sleeper books that I have always felt deserve to be bestsellers, because they're just beautiful. And The November Girl I've read probably 6 times. Spoiler, I edited them both, but I edited them because I love them. They're amazing. Any other questions? Or I can just keep rambling to you about Lydia Kang. My lipstick, thank you. My nephew, I wore this to a little winter festival we had here in town this weekend, and my 4-year-old nephew saw me wearing it, and he asked for matching lipstick. So there's a picture of us in matching lipstick on Twitter.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, when you're building a premise for when you're actually just when you're starting a novel, when you're trying to move from premise to outline,
Hmm.
these are this premise is more, I guess, uh, for your query letter or when you're marketing to different people or you're trying to tell them what's going on. So how much of this can we use when we're actually just starting out?
Yeah. You can use all of it. You know, if you have the idea and you want to sit down and nail out these ingredients before you even start plotting the book, go for it. My process is more give and take. You know, I typically, well, I have a concept that I'm working on right now. You know, and I've had the story seed, I guess, for years, but now I'm finally developing it, and I've gone through and intentionally developed each of these layers. But now that I'm hitting the outline stage, I need to go back and tweak some of them a little. And then once I've got my outline and actually start writing chapters, I know that I'm going to go back and change the outline a little, and I'm going to go back and change the premise a little, you know? So for me, they all kind of shift and they're kind of on unstable ground really until I finish that draft. But I want to have a working idea of all of it. You know, I don't want to say, oh, I'll just leave originality by the wayside until I'm done writing and then try and weave it in later. That won't work so hot for me, I know. So I would say, like, give a shot at developing this to start with, and then update it and revise it just like you would, you know, your outline or anything else as you're drafting. And then when you get to the revision stage, go back and check and see what needs tightened or how your understanding of these things has changed as you've walked yourself into the world. You know, oftentimes I find I struggle with immersive setting until I put people in a room, and I'm like, what's in this room? And that's when I stop to think about it. I think the danger with that process comes if you don't stop to think about it. If you're distracted by the emotional appeal of the scene or, you know, the conflict of the moment or whatever it is. So don't forget that as you're writing, it's really tough to hold all those things in tension at the same time and write all of them at the same time. So if you need to do it in layers, I don't think that that's, you know, a problem at all. Just make sure that you do eventually do it. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
So really, you can do it whenever, but you say start with it and then go back and check and then tweak and etc. Anything else?
I have a question. I think one of my biggest problems sometimes is like, well, it sounds like a great idea when I first start.
Mm-hmm.
And then I start getting into the story, and then you realize, oh, maybe the premise wasn't really that strong to begin with. So, any extra tips like how to avoid that, or other than just make sure you have all these things? Does that make any sense, what I just said?
Yeah. I think a lot of writers start with one of these ingredients, and that it's something that seems really original to them or full of conflict or really imaginative or emotionally appealing. And they just kind of start with that story seed and then build a plot around it. And I think that is where you can get into trouble with the premise, is that you never really had a premise. You had an idea, you had a plot, you know, and you don't want to discover you have no premise at page 300. Like that's a rude awakening, and it's also really hard to fix. Like that's one of the things I say, reasons I say lean hard into intentionally developing every layer of your premise is because you can't insert a premise after the fact. You can't revise it in layer by layer. You know, that's a start from page one kind of deal. And that can, you know, wind up with excellent books. You know, like you're not wasting the work you've done before then. Not all of it anyway, but you certainly will end up redoing a lot of it if you discover at page 300 you don't have a strong enough premise. So if you're feeling like your premise isn't strong enough, stop and check. And it's really tempting to say, oh, there's inherent conflict in my world because, you know, Ron and Leslie are at odds. Is that enough to carry your novel? You know, that's enough for Parks and Rec, you know, a show from people who have name recognition with headliners in it, you know, for an easy entry point, you know, like a 22-minute sitcom has a pretty darn easy entry point. But keep in mind, books work differently. You know, we don't have streaming subscriptions, you know, for books really. We feel books take opening something up and sitting down with it and having a relatively quiet place to read, whereas TV has a much lower barrier of entry. You know, we feel like TV happens to us, right? But we happen to books. And so there's a higher, a higher barrier of entry there with a novel, especially with a novel because it's long. People will take a chance on a TV show or a movie that they will not take on a book. So don't let yourself off the hook with that. You know, push it deeper. Ask other people. Pick up some bestsellers and look at their world. Like intentionally analyze your favorite stories for these, see how they do it. Make sure that you're not taking a sliver of inherent conflict as enough to run the book off of. Any other questions? Or even just content check. Was this all stuff you guys have thought through before? Is this all same old to you? Or is there stuff here that you're like, oh yeah, I need to do that?
Well, it's not new to me, but I've never seen it packaged quite so well. Like I've never seen it packaged as, you should do this at your premise, because if I had, then I would be done with my book by now.
Yeah.
Or maybe a couple more books in. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good. So these are things, you know, I think with craft discussion, what can get tricky is a lot of these things are hopefully intuitive to some of us, even if we haven't articulated them as such, which, you know, is kind of what some of you are saying. I think is that the articulation and the focus is what really matters here. So if this is stuff you've heard before, make sure that you're articulating it for your own self, in your own genre, in your own voice, you know, in your world. Like actually take the time to pause and apply it, because I have met a lot of writers and actually edited for a lot of writers and find myself doing this too. Gosh, so annoying when you do find out you're doing it yourself and not practicing what you're preaching. But I have talked to a lot of writers who say, oh yeah, this is, you know, what makes a compelling premise. And I'm like, but I read your book and it was missing these things, you know, or when it comes to actual application, I think is where the disconnect happens. So if your brain knows this, check your application, because I've talked about this with agents too, and they're like, yeah, these things just don't show up. Same as with high stakes. You know, everyone knows high stakes, right? We could recite it in our sleep. But when it actually comes to looking at the slush pile and what gets published and whatnot, one of the people's main complaints is, why should I care? Or, you know, I liked your story but didn't love it, you know, and that comes down to a stakes thing. So a lot of these things we do already know, but make sure you articulate it for yourself in your own voice and genre, and make sure that you are actually applying it, because to know it is not the same thing as to do it, right?
I think that the books that were easiest for me to write were the ones where I was super clear about what the book was when I started. So it went really fast. Mm-hmm. But this one I'm working on now, I started it 3 years ago and I was a different writer. Now I'm like, what the hell was I thinking?
That sounds really familiar. Yep. And if you're wanting more in-depth discussion of these, the 2 books here I have on the sidebar go into them in really, really good detail, and with different examples than I chose and different language than I chose, and their own spin on it. Secrets of Story actually is a brilliant book, and it has more nuance to the same points that Breakout Novel makes, at least about this premise issue. So if you're wanting to process this more or deeper or in slightly different ways, pick up those 2 books. A lot of libraries have them too, or you can ask your library to bring it in for you. They would love to do that for you. And that way you can get it for free as well. You can also read a good chunk of them just by clicking the look inside feature on Amazon too, to see if it's something that you even want to, you know, pursue and put effort into. I do that with a lot of writing books. So you never know when it's just going to be too 101 or, you know, not something you personally connect with. Okay, yeah, if this isn't something that you've put intentional effort into crafting the premise yet, definitely stop and start doing that. And really the beauty of this kind of work on your story is that it makes the plot so natural. you'll have to put in so much less work into plotting if you have all these ingredients on the table already. You know, you'll end up twisting them and relayering them and tweaking them as you execute it, but it's going to make it so much more easy because you just, you know, it's the tires on the whole thing. It's the wheels for your story. It's just going to propel itself. Yeah, if you do want to volunteer for the workshop next week, in which I'll critique, you know, a number of randomly drawn premises from you all, go ahead and email me, and I'll let you know. I use random.org, and I just assign everybody a number, and then I let you know who was chosen. And if you're chosen, I'll let you know, and you can send me over your premises if you want them critiqued in public. If you want to go through that little ordeal. But yeah, so that'll be the webinar for next week, is we'll actually look at application to your books of some of these things and break down, you know, the whole premise. All right, anything else?
Yeah, I think this was part of the problem I was having last year working on a proposal, especially when I switched and started working on the second one, was that the premise that I had originally set for myself and what was the hook for me, it was no longer coming through in the story, and I couldn't get those two things to connect.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, I couldn't do it until I had sorted all of that out in my head, and I'm still not 100% sure I got it, but I have the deal now, so I have to write it. But it definitely helps, I think, to have a really clear sense of your premise when you begin, because as you get stuff later, you're like, what was I writing about? Oh yeah, this is the thing I'm writing about.
Mm-hmm.
It helps.
Yeah. Listen to Alexis, everybody. She's our big award winner, you know, so she's got the credentials. But okay, so, well, I don't want to keep you all too late, especially since this isn't, well, for me, it's an evening session. For some of you, it's a very early morning session. But if you have any other questions, you know, as always, feel free to post them in Slack, or any other, you know, discussion points that you want to keep the conversation going. Feel free to post that in there, and everybody else can chime in as well. I'll get this edited and up on the YouTube playlist just as soon as I can, and that way you can review if you want and just get it live to everybody else. But I hope this was helpful, and thank you all for listening and joining in the conversation with me and telling me that I do need to watch The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And I hope you all have a great evening. Thanks for coming, everybody.